welcome to Behind the Opinion, where we get a little more insight and background into some of our series regulars. This time I have Jake on with me.
Hello.
So Jake, let's go ahead and launch right into it. First, can you tell me the first game you recall playing and how that affected your enthusiasm for gaming?
That's a pretty hard question to answer because I grew up during the era of arcades.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was kind of always somewhat surrounded by games just because the arcades were found at, grocery stores and all sorts of different places. And I think probably the first one that I really have a memory of is I went over to my cousin's house and they had a copy of Combat, Atari Combat, which is a tank game for the old Atari home console, 2600. Of course, I was also like 3 years old, so I was terrible at it.
And that has not changed to this day. Sorry, go ahead.
Do I look like Brent? Sorry, Brent.
Ooh. Coming in hot.
Yeah, but that really didn't build the enthusiasm. And of course, being of the era of the arcades, I had all of the Pac-Mans and the Galagas and all those other games that were around at the time. But I think the first one I remember playing that was more not, playing with my cousins who were much better than me was probably Ghouls and Goblins.
Ooh.
And, of course, Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt when my dad bought a Nintendo Entertainment System the year after Rob came out.
Gotcha. Now, how did those games affect your enthusiasm? The early ones you can recall playing.
Realistically, just the idea of playing a video game just seemed cool to me. I don't know if there was one big thing that really hooked me other than the fact that video games were just cool. Though probably if I had to go to the most impactful game came quite a bit later when I was older in middle school, and that was...
Oh, we'll get to that later.
Oh.
Don't worry.
Oh.
Favorite game is later.
Not favorite game. Probably most impactful. The game that really got me into gaming, I think.
Would you call that your most significant game memory?
Probably.
Then we will get to that later.
Okay.
One thing I found fascinating, and this is one of those generational things, I'm going to say it that way even though you are not that significantly older, I have always been fascinated by the era of arcades and the time when machines that were so powerful that you couldn't have them at home only existed in these other places. So back when the heyday of the arcades, or even better, arcades before decent graphics existed, like back when arcades were more mechanical than video. That was something that has always interested me. But the idea of arcades being the superior machine, nowadays it blows my mind to think there was a point where a arcade game was inherently better than a console game. For example, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 was better in arcades. Splatterhouse, better in arcades.
I actually remember when they announced the Neo Geo, they were basically like, not only can you play these at the arcade, but you can save them on a card, take them home, and play the exact same game at home. And I'm like, no, that's not possible. The hardware isn't capable of doing that at home. You're high. That'll never happen. And now today it's like...
It's on your phone.
Oh, yeah, no kidding. Of course, your phone is 100 times more powerful than a Cray supercomputer was when it was released back in the 70s, so...
And, I mean, 1 trillion times more powerful than when you invented fire. On that cheerful note, what would you say your favorite genre of game is, and why is that your favorite genre?
Honestly, I think my favorite genre... and this actually kind of ties into an episode we're probably going to work on here shortly, is I love narrative games.
Now, when you say narrative, can you provide a little more context there?
Games that are very plot-heavy. Trying to think of how best to describe it.
Now, are those games that rely mostly on the plot, like your walking simulators we discussed many moons ago?
No.
Okay.
I do like walking simulators, but I feel that there needs to be more interaction for a lot of games, but more along the lines of your modern-day Tomb Raider, Horizon Zero Dawn, Mass Effect. Just games that have a big, deep, involved story that really pulls you in. And I think a lot of that really goes back to the fact that when I was younger, I was an avid reader. I mean, I still love to read, but not like I did back then. In high school, my teachers had standing orders from my mother that if they caught me with a book, they were to take the book away. And when that would happen in class, I would just reach down into my book bag and pull out another book and start reading that instead. I mean, I loved to read. So narrative games are kind of an extension of that, where it's this awesome story, and instead of it taking place in your mind, you're being interactive with it. You're being part of it and helping move it along of your own pace.
Makes perfect sense. So what would you say your favorite game is? Would you say it's a narrative game?
That's a really difficult question.
So I'll allow you to be very broad first, but then I'm going to clinch down.
I can't really say I have a 100% all-time favorite. If you were to ask me what my favorite game is of the most modern era, I would probably say Horizon Zero Dawn.
Shocker.
Yeah, I know. But there are a lot of games out there that, depending on the era, like if we're talking the the GameCube, it would probably be the Tales of Symphonia.
Now that surprises me only because you have such a fondness for Eternal Darkness, but
Tales of Symphonia is better. It's a JRPG with a...
Is that the one where you play as the red kid?
The red kid. Yes, he wears red.
Okay, and something about angels?
Yeah, something like that. It has a story that's very reminiscent of the mess with your head of old Final Fantasy games.
How old we talking here?
Like Final Fantasy VI.
Okay. I forget we're up to 15, because when I think old, I'm like, Final Fantasy 3? Like, no. Nowadays, 7 is considered old.
Well, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking about maybe like the PS2, it would be Suikoden 2.
That was PS1. I know that for a fact.
Oh, you're right. That is PS1.
I know it for a fact.
And one of the most impactful games was Wolfenstein 3D and or Doom.
Mm-hmm.
Wolfenstein 3D was obviously the first FPS that I was ever shown. And there was just something about that first-person perspective that really drew me in more than any other game before it had done. And, of course, then I found Doom, and I played Doom, and Doom is even... we mentioned this before. It was the first game that I ever gave a brown shorts award to, because it was terrifying. If you're like 14 years old.
Oh, yeah, we discussed this on the episode about scary games, and you said Doom, and I was legit shocked.
Yeah, well, when you're young and playing it in the dark with nobody in the house,
I've been scared by much tamer things when I was a child. In fact, on a recent episode, we talked about how a basic enemy in the game Illusion of Gaia scared me as a child. It was just a gold skeleton. Its skull flew at me. That scared me.
And that's not even a first-person perspective game.
Nope, that is a third-person action game.
And then during the era that I started playing on PC, obviously the Wolfenstein and Doom, as well as Command & Conquer Generals for the RTS genre.
If you had to pick one, which is your favorite?
Man, that's a really hard thing to do, just because it changes so often.
It does. So what is your favorite?
You're really trying for this.
Well, because based on your enthusiasm, and this is an important distinction to make, because criticism has been levied very superficially, mind you. This is, whole game journalism and such. It's been levied that every year-ish, they try to take a poll of what's the greatest game of all time. And a lot of criticism gets levied at it for the greatest game of all time usually shockingly happens to have come out in the last year. That's pretty impressive. Every year they make the greatest game of all time.
Right.
Now, the reason I want to specify this is because I know you love Horizon Zero Dawn, but is that the best game you've ever played, or is that the best game?
I can't say that that's necessarily the best game I've ever played of all time. I've got other games that I've played more of consistently, like the Soul Reaver series. But in terms of narrative and gameplay and graphics and just pretty much across the board, it hits every mark of what I would need.
I am legit shocked. So you would say Horizon Zero Dawn is your favorite game?
Yeah, if it's like gun to my head, I have to answer right now.
Which
yes.
is why I'm glad we're not streaming, so nobody can see the literal gun to your head. No tears, only dreams. Anyways, I'm a little surprised you didn't go with Suikoden 2, honestly, because for the longest time, you talked up that game so hot and heavy.
Yeah, well, I've also talked up Xenogears too, and
Oh, right, sorry. Which Xeno game do I like? The first Xenoblade Chronicles. Okay.
Yeah, well, Xenogears is quite a bit darker than all of the other ones I've ever seen. Yeah, Suikoden is definitely in the top 5 for me.
The first one or second one?
Second one.
I'm about to say, because
the first one is good, but it was really just more of a demo to make sure that they could make the game they wanted for the second one.
that was the vibe I got off of it, to be 100% frank.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it was. They had the story for 2, but they didn't know if they could make the game. So they wrote another story and made that 1 to make sure that they could do it right.
Makes sense. So, with the gun taken away from your head, are you now comfortable talking about your most significant game memory?
Yeah, I think that hits back into the when I was talking about the Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, because, again, those were the ones that really... They turned me from, I guess you'd say, the kid who just liked to play games when he was over at his dad's house, to I just want to play games.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was what pushed it into, I don't want to call it an addiction, but
a passion.
Yes, a passion.
Now, it's interesting that you would mention that particular game, just because you talked up the narrative focus of games quite a lot. What made that the most significant? Was it the immersion you mentioned before?
Yes.
What was it?
It was definitely the immersion. I mean, there was a story there.
Yeah.
It wasn't a very in-depth story, and it was mostly during the in-between of the episodes that you would get any information, but there was a little bit of a story there. I mean, if you had to go for story, Half-Life definitely did that better. But Half-Life also came, 5 years later.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, Valve said they're getting back into making games.
Yeah, and they did not mention that they were going to be making a Half-Life 2 Episode 3 / Half-Life 3 / Yeah, the immersion of just that FPS style setup, especially when it came down to, in Doom, I think it was, when you walk and when you run, your gun bobs with you. Like it really would. I just always thought that was a really cool...
cool immersion technique.
Yeah, and when you'd reload, it would actually show you bringing the gun down. Like with the shotgun, it would show you breaking the breech in half, pulling out the shell, putting new ones in, closing it.
And that's a fascinating... I'm sure we don't have many listeners who are significantly younger, but that's always a thing that fascinates me. On a previous episode, I'd mentioned it with somebody, but it's things like people's hair moving in the wind on a Super Nintendo game that really made me go, wow, when I was a kid.
Yeah, the little attention to detail.
And nowadays, that's just everywhere.
Right.
Which isn't bad. In fact, some of the most stunning details of games like Horizon Zero Dawn, which I have played, have beaten, and do agree is a fantastic game. It's the little details that really do stand out, but they're now much littler details.
Yeah, it's...
You kind of take it for granted, to be honest.
It's details that now are expected and would be given, bad marks for not completely putting in there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the Tomb Raider came out with Tress Effects.
I don't know what that means.
The newer Tomb Raider. It was a technology for modeling 3D hair and accelerating it through the GPU. So if you play Tomb Raider on an AMD graphics card, her hair will actually move more realistically than it would on older hardware.
Huh. That's impressive.
And so, now... It's just expected that pretty much every game that comes out after that is going to have it. But if you didn't have an AMD card at the time and you enabled that, it would bog your system.
Makes sense. Now, it's interesting because you mentioned between the significance and your favorite genre, your favorite game wasn't Half-Life or Half-Life 2. So it's curious, In fact, you didn't even really mention those. Is there because I would imagine that a game that has a strong narrative focus from the first-person perspective would be a strong contender for your favorite. Why is that not the case?
Mostly because other games have surpassed it since. I mean, don't get me wrong. Half-Life and Half-Life 2 and each of the episodes have pushed the boundaries every time they've been released.
But they've been over a decade.
Yeah, it's been over a decade since they were out, and other games have pushed that exact same thing to the same level. It's a shame that Valve hasn't continued to push that game because they're so good at pushing boundaries. Because now when you play FPSs, you expect there's going to be a good story in the campaign mode. But before Half-Life, there really wasn't that very often. I mean, System Shock and System Shock 2 were one of the few that had it.
But that was also dependent on... Those were only on PC, weren't they? Mm-hmm. And actually come to... Yeah, no, the original Half-Life was on PlayStation 2.
Much later. They did come out, but they came out much later.
I can't speak to how much later.
Because those were done by Sierra, and Sierra at the time was specifically a PC
developer.
They weren't a developer, they were a, what EA does, publisher.
Gotcha. That makes sense. All right. Well, on that note, I think we can transition a bit into the more enthusiasm about this particular venture we are undertaking. Why do you enjoy talking about video games?
Well, just because, first off, I enjoy playing games and I enjoy, discourse and discussions. Since I have a lot of friends that play games, we all like games. So, having someone to talk to about that is awesome. And there's also the fact that games got me into computers. And computers is what I do for a living. Technology, keeping up with technology in general always fascinates me. Which is why, I'll sometimes be a little bit more technical in our discussions than a lot of the other guests tend to be. Mm-hmm. So there's that, and games have always been a big part of my life. I find them more substantial than, say, TV entertainment, partially because of that immersion, and there's a level of creativity in games that you often don't see in TVs. Or in TV shows and movies and stuff like that.
Makes sense. So, on that note, I have noticed and appreciate that whenever we do record episodes, you do usually come armed with a bevy of technical background, which does present a unique perspective that I really appreciate when we record these. And do you find when you have these discussions with other people that perspective continues to help them in these discussions? Because some things you've said, specifically in the Zelda episode, there were little technical details about the difference between the NES version and the Famicom version that while I may have been familiar with, I don't think that the audience at large was familiar with, particularly the microphone and the Satellaview. Those were two big details. Do you find that there's a lot of other people who can also feel like they gain from the expanded technical perspective you bring?
I think so. When back in probably 99, 2000, following console hardware was the thing, when the PlayStation 2, the GameCube were coming out, and the Xbox, there were actually websites out there that did deep dives on the consoles, on the console hardware, and they would tell you the PlayStation 2 is based off of a, MIPS processor and this custom-made graphics design chip and all these, different things. One of the things was, Microsoft was trying to get into the console, and their first one was the Xbox. Well, the Xbox was nothing more than a low-powered laptop shoved into a giant case.
There was actually some fascinating discussion with the 360, I believe, where they said there were going to be 6 different versions of it. Do you remember that?
I don't.
The only reason I remember it is because I specifically remember a frequent contributor to the show, Brent, talking about how they were going to hold out for the laptop version of the 360. Okay.
Yeah, the 360 was Microsoft's first attempt at making a non-PC bound console. Not Intel-based. And they did a good job. The hardware was actually pretty advanced. The problem was they didn't set up the cooling for it properly, and so it tended to kind of desolder its chips off the board.
But it still had to, and this is a little too shop talky, so we'll probably derail it after this. It had to have a more approachable architecture, because I remember the PS3 in particular, even near the tail end of the hardware lifespan, people still said they didn't really know how to use all the potential there.
Yeah, if you go back, Sony has had a very bad relationship with their developers, because if you go back and talk to a lot of the different developers on each one of their consoles, they pretty much always say, yeah, it's awful. The PS3 is probably the worst offender, but the PS2 came with a stack of books that was probably about 3 feet tall, and you could read them it was a bunch of volumes, and you would read them volume 1 through like 12, I think it was. And a lot of times you would end up having to re-reference things in previous volumes as you were reading the later ones. And like, there was a company that created a dev kit for the PlayStation 2 that was superior to Sony's.
Nice.
That's how bad developing for Sony consoles has been, which is why it's kind of no surprise that they're based off of a PC and the PlayStation 4.
About to say, the PS4 has seemed to be significantly more accessible, because I know that for at least a minute there, Sony was winning the hand of indies aside from PC game. It was the preeminent indie console for several years. I believe that the Switch has swooped in dramatically.
Yeah, the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 are very similar in hardware. They use the same GPU, they use the same CPU. The difference is really in how fast their clock speeds are and how much RAM and what type of RAM.
Well, and that being said, I don't know the apples-to-apples comparison between the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X, but we're about to get a little too editorial for this particular interview.
No one cares about those particular branches of the PS whatever and the Xbox One X.
Yeah, I can't.
Or as people call it now, the Xbox.
Whew. That's still a point of frustration. I will never... I'm still waiting for the Xbox One X 360.
Yeah, well...
Yeah, come full circle. Or come...
Literally.
Ba-dum-bum. Anyways, on that awesome pun, what would you say your hope for the future of gaming is?
My hope, and it's pie in the sky pretty much, but less focus on pure profit motives. I've always thought that games tend to be their strongest when their goal isn't just to make money, because when you're trying to just make money, you have this tendency to go the safe route, and gaming doesn't work well like that. I mean, you can only make the same game so many times before everybody goes, this is dumb, we're not buying it anymore.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, Assassin's Creed, right?
That's a really good example of, well, and they got greedy too, because they were like, we're going to put it out every year.
We're going to put it out every year, and then we're going to... Yeah, no, that's
the equivalent of eating, gorging yourself on Taco Bell and deciding that the outcome is good.
Hey, don't you knock the bell. Some of us here prefer to think outside the blind.
Okay.
Continue.
That's one of the things that companies like Valve, that thinking outside the box and pushing the boundaries is something that they were really good at when they were making games. And yes, I know they've announced they're making games again, but they're releasing a card game. Yay.
Yeah.
But they always thought outside the box. They always pushed boundaries, and they didn't care about the profit of it so much as we want to make a good game. To the point where their internal company structure is, we have no managers. We have no hardcore marketing. It's, if you're good at what you do, you're hired in, and you can... If you come up with an idea, if someone in Valve today were like, I have this great idea for the next episode of Half-Life, they could run with it.
Obviously, nobody's come up with it yet.
Yeah, well, they kind of painted themselves into a corner from what I understand, and now it's been so long that they've built up this hype for it no one's ever going to be able to match it, to live up to the hype.
They've even said that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's ever been an official statement, but ex-devs have said, yeah, it's basically been unofficially scrapped. It's been officially scrapped, but not officially scrapped, because there is no possible way what we deliver can measure up to whatever people want.
Right.
Like, the best case scenario, it's a good game. The worst case scenario, it's the next Duke Nukem forever.
But this is also one of the things that makes indie games so interesting is...
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that, because when you said that, I have a note down here. Indie? Question mark?
Yeah. Indie developers have this ability to come up with an idea and try and run with it. And as long as they can survive long enough to fully develop the game to fruition, they can release it and do interesting things. I mean, Stardew Valley, Frictional Games,
Supergiant Games. I know that the guy who made
Ori and the Blind Forest,
Ori and the Blind Forest, What Remains of Edith Finch, those
Dust
people.
and Elysian Tale. I mean, come on, that guy was an animator by trade, and he just saw this contest and was like, I'm going to try and see if I can write a thing. Wrote this demo all by himself, hand drew all of the sprites, and managed to get funding from Microsoft to build a game, and mostly built that entire game on his own, having never touched programming before that.
So do you not feel, and this will probably be the last on this little tangent right here, do you not feel that there has been a bit of a ebb in terms of indies over the last year or so-ish? Because I feel like in early 2011, 2012, we saw an enormous surge of indies. And then for as cynical as the idea was, Peter Molyneux came out and said, this is great, but it ain't gonna last. Because for as creative as these people want to be, you still gotta put food on the table. And there's gonna come a point where they need structure they don't have. So I kind of feel like we have seen less indies recently, but I also don't know that I've been as plugged into that scene as I used to be.
I think it's a little bit of that. I mean, I think it was more a situation of there was too much of a glut for a while there. If you, like, to the point where there were news articles about how there was just too much garbage on Valve.
They have
on Steam, sorry.
They have mentioned that, and I also feel like there is an interesting thing that's happened where an indie darling is no longer something that's a novelty. For example, just off the top of my head, in the last couple months, the game Celeste came out, the game Iconoclasts came out, I think it was called, and I believe there was another independent game that I'd been watching for a while, and they've all gotten stellar reviews, like, for example, Enter the Gungeon. That got a great review, but great reviewed indie games now, like, it's weird to say, there's so many of them that I'm starting to become kind of blind to them. They're still on my list, but if there's 12 indie games that I need to get to, like, I got a life. I hate to say that. But at the same time, there's games that have been on my to-buy list for literally months at this point.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, they're still out there, Doki Doki Literature Club.
Oh, have you played that?
I have not yet, but it's on my list.
Do you know anything about it?
I mean, I know that it was basically made so that they could get funding to make an actual game, but...
Okay, so you don't know anything about the game itself.
Just that it's kind of a mind trip.
You're going to have to, like, live message me as you're playing it. Because I would... And at some point, I'd love to do one about games that do meta commentary. I hope I didn't spoil anything there by saying it. Like Stanley Parable. I would not call this comparable to Stanley Parable, but as an example of games with meta commentary. Anyways, I would just absolutely love to know your reactions as you're playing it, because the first time you boot it up, this isn't even a spoiler because you see it before you get to the title screen. It gives you a warning for violent, I don't remember if sexual and graphic content is all in the warning. Then it brings up the Doki Doki Literature Club. Anyways, do you have anything else you'd like to add about your hope for the future?
Nothing specifically. The only other thing I could probably say is I'm sick of seeing the EAs and the Activisions of the world be constantly given just more and more money for sucking horribly.
I do kind of wonder, and this is something I had commented on long before we started recording this. I kind of feel like there was a bit of a die-off of this, I feel like, back in 2013-ish, where the expectations versus the amount put in was becoming absolutely unsustainable and unrealistic. I remember Resident Evil 6 moved several million units, and it still wasn't good enough.
Well, it was considered a failure, even though it made its money back, but it didn't make its money back the same way like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 did.
And I think that between redefined expectations and a challenging indie market, I think that AAA developers are approaching these differently now. So your hope for the future might not be as far off as you want or you think.
Maybe, but I mean, like the situation with the whole microtransactions that EA's been doing lately, and they got a bunch of pushback on that.
Yes, indeed.
As they should, but it doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily back off. They're just going to try to find a more insidious way to do it.
Absolutely, but we'll actually delve more into this. Not you, but the episode. We're going to record one on microtransactions before terribly long. So make sure to give a listen to that one.
Oh, sure. Plug it on my Behind the Opinion.
Hey, man. You know, we got to do what we can. Josh gots to get paid. Anyways, anything else, Jake?
No, I think that's it. It's always a pleasure to come on here.
It is always a delight to have you on. Thank you very much for assisting me in this venture.
Not a problem.
But until next time, this has been Behind the Opinion with Jake.